Marlene and everybody else, thank you very much. It's always an honor and a pleasure here to be with you. This is a topic that's very dear to my heart. I have a research interest in type 1 diabetes, as Dr. Marlene pointed out, in the prevention of type 1 diabetes. But at our center, more than half the patients we see, the visits we see, are diabetes. We have almost 3,000 children with diabetes, and 85% of them are type 1 diabetes. This is a big part of all of our lives. I want to talk to you about what's new. There's a lot new. Even since the last time I did this at this meeting in the last few years, maybe 3 years ago, much has changed. Much has changed for the better, except this is a cautionary tale. There's lots of good news, and there's some surprisingly disappointing news that I want to tell you about where we stand in new technology for diabetes. So let's start out with one premise. When I learned to take care of diabetes in the late 1970s, early 1980s, it was really easy. We didn't ask much of the patients. We asked them to mix 2 different kinds of insulin together, a clear one and a cloudy one. They gave an injection. You couldn't do home glucose testing. Blood glucose testing, they would maybe urinate in a cup once or twice a day and test the urine for glucose, and that was it. And we didn't know how to measure whether how good their control was. I'm going to tell you in a moment about a landmark study that made it very clear that the better controlled your diabetes is, the lower your risk of developing complications later. When I was in medical school, that was not clear. There were people that said you could have very good control, but there was, again, no way to really define good control by the technology we had. And some of those people with good control had complications, and some of the people with poor control didn't have complications. It was confusing. So the key point is we make diabetes management very complicated now because it really makes a difference. And I'm going to tell you just a brief one slide, just remind you about the Diabetes Complications and Control trial that established that tight control, keeping blood glucose as close to normal as possible, prevents complications. So it's clear that old ways of taking care of diabetes were not good enough, and that something had to change. This was the landmark study. This actually originated at my university long before I was there, Vanderbilt University. But this asked the question, does it matter how well controlled you are? This happened in the 1980s. It was designed in the 1980s. It went for, I think, 9 years, ended in roughly 93. The first publications came out. But at that point, we had another tool to determine how good was your control, and that was the hemoglobin A1c, the percentage of your hemoglobin A1 fraction that was glycosylated was directly proportional to your blood glucose. So an A1c of 6% was roughly equivalent to 120 milligrams per deciliter, and pretty much linearly you could get an idea of the average glucose over the preceding 3 months. It's not a lifelong kind of assay, but the preceding 3 months, there was a connection. And look at this. Retinopathy, nephropathy, neuropathy, microalbuminuria, all of the micro and macrovascular complications of diabetes are markedly reduced as you bring the average blood glucose down to normal. Now remember, an average blood glucose is just that, an average. It doesn't tell you you're not running too high in the morning or you're not going low. You don't have a good average because you have highs that are too high and lows that are too low. It's a very crude tool, but it's the best we have and still have to determine overall control. So that DCCT informed us that we had to do better. The 2018 American Diabetes Association guidelines established that a hemoglobin A1c of less than 7.5% is recommended across all age groups. We used to think that little children, toddlers and babies, should not be exposed to the risk of hypoglycemia. And so we had higher standards for toddlers and infants. But we learned later that the risk is not from hypoglycemia. The risk is from hyperglycemia of neurodevelopmental problems, cognitive issues later that we're not going to go into today. But basically, less than 7.5%, which means that the before meal blood glucose target is between 90 and 130, and the overnight target is between 90 and 140 to maintain an A1c in that range. That's not so easy. And if we're all pediatricians. Getting kids to do this, especially it's somewhat easier in toddlers and because the mom's in control or the dad. But when you get to the adolescents and young adults, it's a nightmare. We become coaches. We're not so much doctors. And here's good evidence of that. This is a figure from the Type 1 Diabetes Exchange from the I think this is the 2010 to 2012 period. This is lots of individuals with type 1 diabetes. It includes adults. This is the average hemoglobin A1c from essentially, well, we don't see kids at birth, but I think this is about age 2 through adulthood. Right here is adolescence. All right? It's a nightmare. Now, why? Because one is their adolescence, right? They don't want to do this. They have autonomy issues, but there's the physiologic reasons too. This is the time when you have pubertal development, the sex steroids, growth hormone that are secreted during puberty make you profoundly insulin resistant. So it's much harder to deal with. But look at that. That's awful. But that's our world as pediatricians, is this hump here. One thing to look forward to is when they get older, but they're not our patients anymore, things get better. They mature. And the physiology gets easier. So I'm going to run through rather quickly, because I do want to end on time, some new technology, and then come back to that slide. So this is the old way. Bottle of insulin, a syringe. Well, we have pens now. You put in a cartridge. You can dial in the dose of the insulin. It's handy. You can take it to school with you. You can take it on trips. And the old way that didn't exist when I was in medical school was a home glucose meter. These are rapid. Just in a few seconds, on a few microliters of blood, you can get a blood glucose determination. That's all disappearing. So what do we have now? Insulin pumps as a way to administer the insulin. There are 3 major ones. I believe in Europe these are also marketed, and there was one from Switzerland, the Medtronic pump that disappeared like a decade or more ago. You see 2 of them have tubing attached to them. This is the Medtronic pump, and this is the T-Slim pump. They operate with tubing to deliver the insulin. So the pump mechanism is in this box. There's a reservoir, I'll show you that in a moment, that delivers insulin through the tubing to the patient. The departure from that is the Omnipod, in which the pump, the reservoir, the mechanics of the pump are all here in a disposable pod, it's called, and the brains of the pod is this PDM, Patient Diabetes Manager, that basically controls this. So what happens is you put this on, every 72 hours you have to change it on the patient, and you dispose of it. The pump, it seems like a waste, but that's how it goes. It's disposed of. You don't dispose of this. This is where the expense and the brains of the pump are. So let's show a little bit more about this. So there's the pump we talked about. This is what reservoirs look like. So in the Omnipod, you can't see it, but there's something like this here that's driven by a little motor with a screw on it. The Medtronic pump has these kinds of reservoirs. It's essentially a syringe, and a little screw, again, advances it and administers insulin. The T-Slim pump reservoir is something like this, but those are what reservoirs look like. These get changed every 72 hours. You cannot leave an infusion set, and here's what infusion sets look like, in for more than 72 hours because your risk of infections and scarring becomes pretty marked at that point. Essentially, these are different brands of them. There are 2 variations. One goes in straight at 90 degrees to the skin, goes directly in. If you're very lean, however, and there are still kids who are very lean, you used a pump an infusion set that is angled at a 30-degree angle, and it tunnels under the skin a bit to give you a little bit better insertion site. That's called the silhouette. So that has to be changed every 72 hours. All right, the key to what goes on with an insulin pump is that there are 2 modes of delivery. For those of you who remember the cloudy insulins of the old days or the glargine insulin of today, these were longer acting preparations. The pumps are always filled with a rapid acting insulin, either Aspart, I think you call it Actropid in Europe, it's sold that way, or Novo Rapid, yeah. In the US it's called Novolog. But the basic point is you use 1 insulin in the pump. There's no long-acting insulin, but you deliver it either with a basal rate of X number of units per hour. All right, but one thing you can do with a pump that you cannot do with the analog insulins that are long-acting is that you can set different rates. So for example, the dawn phenomenon of puberty, where in the early morning hours between, let's say, midnight and 6 in the morning, there are huge surges in testosterone, estrogen, growth hormone. Those all make you insulin resistant, so you can increase the basal rate, just like the body does physiologically. Pumps are wonderful in many respects. they can give tiny little increments of insulin, which you cannot do with a pen. The most you can do with a pen or a syringe is half-unit increments. Here you can go to 0.05 units per hour changes, and which is really ideal for babies. Now, there's a lot about pumps that's not ideal for babies, but that's one of them. You can give precise dosing. So you have a basal rate and you have a bolus. Bolus is a rapid infusion, just like an injection of insulin that's given at meal times to cover the carbohydrates you consume. So you determine the dose based on the number of grams of carbohydrate and a ratio. For example, 1 unit of insulin covers 15 grams of carbohydrate. In adolescents, that can be 1 unit for 5 grams. In toddlers, it can be 1 unit for 40 grams. But that's the range of sensitivity to insulin. And then you have a correction scale. You check the glucose before the meal. You give a dose of insulin that's calculated and empirically, more or less, to lower the glucose back into normal range, like mid-course corrections. So those are the way pumps function. And again, you can be very precise with those. So the advantages are huge. It eliminates the injections. It's basically, it's attached to the child and or the patient, doesn't have to be a child. There are no more injections given with pens or other devices. It's far more precise. You can, if you're sick, you can change your basal rate. You can put a temporary basal rate. If you're going to play football, you can lower the basal rate because you know that prolonged exercise is going to make you more insulin sensitive. So you can do all sorts of very cool things with pumps. Certain foods require that you deliver the insulin not abruptly like a bolus normally does, but over a prolonged period of time. And that's called the extended bolus. So pumps will allow you to give some, they have different names depending on the manufacturer, but the concept is instead of giving X number of units for the food, this would be for like high-fat foods that delay the absorption of carbohydrates from the meal. You can extend that over 4 hours instead of the infusion over 4 hours rather than just a rapid infusion. And insulin pumps have been proven, I won't show you data about that, to improve glycemic control. So I think I missed one here. The next concept that came in, the finger sticks, those are going away, and I'm really delighted to see that. In place of continuous glucose monitors, CGMs. Now, here's the bloodstream. When you check a blood glucose, you stick a little needle through the lancet that pierces down to here, you get some blood. You get whole blood. This is reading interstitial fluid. Under normal circumstances, there's a good equilibrium between blood glucose and the interstitial fluid glucose so that they're about the same. But when things are changing rapidly, so let's say you have a meal and you miscalculate the dose and you give an injection of insulin and you start to drop quickly, it might be 30 minutes before the glucose here that's read by the CGM actually tells you what's happening in the blood glucose. So when we have children wearing these devices, we'll say to them, if you feel like your blood sugar is dropping and your CGM is not reflecting what you think, check a blood glucose. Don't throw away the meter. You need to rely on the blood because eventually they'll equilibrate, but you don't want to wait till they have a seizure to find out that they were actually dropping. So what's involved in a CGM? This is the Medtronic one. That's the Dexcom. There's a little electrode, very fine. But it still is uncomfortable for smaller children sometimes to insert that goes into the interstitial fluid. There's a transmitter. The Medtronic is a kind of bulky one. Dexcom is this one. Well, they're both bulky, but that transmits to a receiver. So, right, there's no wire, there's no tubing attached to these things. That's the Dexcom G6 and the Medtronic CGMs. And then they're received either at a specified receiver. Dexcom was the first. It can go to a telephone. It can not only go to a telephone, it can go to Apple Watches, iWatches. It can be transmitted to the mother. The kid can be in college in California and the mother can live in San Francisco, in Washington, D.C. Mom can keep an eye on what their child's blood glucose is telling them. Now, let me tell you, that's a problem for a lot of kids. A lot of adolescents do not want their mother watching their blood sugar and calling them to tell them, like, hey, what's going on here? You're dropping or you're doing this. I've got great stories, but I don't have time to tell you this. But it's reading the interstitial fluid glucose every 5 minutes, which is really outstanding. And then you can get all sorts of very, very good data from these because, I think the next slide talks about this, you can have alerts programs. So when you go above or below a certain threshold, it can alarm you. you can have alerts that tell you when you're dropping at a rapid rate. So there are little symbols on there. I can't remember if I've got a picture of it. An arrow sideways means it's steady. You're not dropping or rising very quickly. But if you have two arrows down, means you're starting to drop quickly or you're going up. And it makes predictions. Like if you don't treat this, you might have a blood glucose of 124, but if you get two arrows down, that means within 30 minutes you're going to be below 70 or however you set it. So there's a lot of good information you can get from these. The problem is the alerts are frequent and they are frequently ignored by kids. Remember, I've got at the end some disappointing news. Think of that one. All right, here's something that I know is available. It actually was out in Europe before it came to the States. It's a version of a CGM, but it's not as fancy as the Dexcom that I told you about. This is the Freestyle Libre. So that is a sensor. That is a transmitter, but not of the sort that the Dexcom is. Remember, the Dexcom can be picked up by a cell phone and then transmitted to other cell phones. This one, you have a sensor that's applied here and a reader, and the only way you can tell what the glucose is to pass the reader over the sensor. So you have to physically interrogate it, ask it what's the glucose, and it'll tell you what it is, and then it'll download the last 8 hours of readings that it has, but it's not continuously like alerting the patient like, hey, you're dropping, you're doing this. You have to like be active about this, which may not be a bad thing. It has 14 days of use. The original CGMs were like 7 days, 10 days. Now we're getting up to 14 days. I should have mentioned the Dexcom is like that. All right, here's another one that's new. I honestly don't see a place for this in pediatrics, but this is an implantable continuous glucose monitor. It means it goes under the skin like we do a lot of sustained release hormones. And then you tape a transmitter over that. So it's in place for 90 days. You have to have a physician kind of insert it. It's probably expensive. Somebody's making money doing this, all these things. The transmitter must be charged daily for about 10 to 15 minutes. Like I said, I'm not sure I see a place for this in our population, and I'm not even sure if I were an adult I'd want to have something implanted under my skin. But the key point about CGMs is they're accurate enough to replace finger sticks. The most recent Dexcom, the G6 version, has been approved to allow you to make glucose determinations without finger stick confirmation, which is really important. All right, here's an old way. Here's a glucose log that we used to get. Remember, the older version was handwritten logs that were largely made up by teenagers, I can tell you that. But here's an interrogation of someone's insulin pump so they come into the clinic, we download it, and we get information about the glucose, which is in that place up there, that upper row, how many grams of carbohydrate they entered into the pump, and then how much insulin was administered. Now you can see this person here, like here's a day with 2 readings, what happened over here? And often I'll see downloads like this with no readings for 4 days, and like, oh, I must have used another meter. This is old school. So let's go to so if you take a meter and download it, there's a tool now called the Gluco, which allows you to plot a scatter plot. This is for the last 30 days. This one is actually 2 weeks. No, it's 30 days of readings. So you get some information here. Here's the average blood glucose these are blood glucose determined. This is not a CGM. This person is actually checking on average 6 times a day. They get a big pat on the back, because sometimes I see 0.6 as the number of times they're checking per day. And when I ask the kid, like, wait, you're checking before every meal? And they go, oh yeah, every time. And I'll say, like, you eat 0.6 times a day? And well, no. But you can see a lot of information there. So let me show you. Here you see a trend, like the morning blood glucoses, this is midnight, noon, midnight, are running high. This person probably could use a little bit better basal rate at night. Look what happens after a meal here. It probably needs a stronger insulin to carbohydrate dose between breakfast and lunch. And then there's a lot of eating in the afternoon, a lot of high glucose in the afternoon when they're not eating meals, theoretically. They're probably snacking. So there's a lot you can learn from the blood glucoses. Let's go to what the CGMs do. So remember, CGM is every 5 minutes for a course of a day. Now that's not very useful. That's like 3 different days there, and like I defy you to find trends in that, although you see a lot of high numbers. So here's where you superimpose a bunch of CGM trends on top of each other. Well, it's a little more useful. There's something going on this part of the day, but it's just like a bunch of lines, except when you do it this way. So this is the mean, the dashed line, blood glucose. This is the 75th and 25th percentile for the numbers. Now you start to see patterns. I love this. This is the Dexcom download, which the patients can do on their own at home. Most don't, but they do. So here's someone here who's running kind of high overnight, but you see sometimes they're dropping low. Well, all right, this kid needs a higher basal rate to bring that down, but this is because mom goes in and checks them during the night. Many parents will do this 2 or 3 times and gives correction doses, then overcorrect. And that's what those lines, so that's 80 milligrams per deciliter. These are down into the 60s. Well, that's iatrogenically, momogenically induced. And then here, look at this one. They start to drop low after lunch. Probably that insulin to carbohydrate ratio is too strong. But you can see you can pick up a lot of trends from this kind of analysis. And everybody who wears these things has this at their disposal. I'll come back to this later, but most don't. That's the problem. It allows people to become emotionally disengaged from the diabetes. All right, last thing. Last year, for those of you who were here, I actually had a whole session about this pump, which was the first hybrid closed loop system, meaning this is the Medtronic 670G, the first one in the American market, and as far as I know, in Europe as well, that allows the CGM, the glucose monitoring system, to tell the pump both in an upward and downward direction, you need more insulin, you need less insulin. But it's got a lot of limitations. All right, so here's what it looks like. This is the Medtronic pump. There's the infusion site here. There's the sensor. This, again, radio frequency tells the pump what the glucose is doing. The pump has algorithms to say you need more basal or less basal. The only thing that this pump can do is alter the basal rate. It does not change the mealtime doses. And it's actually become more complicated because, let me just see if I go back here. I'll come back to that slide. The patient, it's not fully automated, and I'll just one more editorial comment. The type 1 diabetes community, when this came out, got all excited and said, this is the artificial pancreas we've been waiting for. It is not. An artificial pancreas is when you plop a device on you or in you and you forget that you have diabetes. You don't carb count, you don't check blood sugars, you're disengaged from this. That's what a normal pancreas does, and it should be for diabetes. So it's not a closed loop system. They still are required to enter blood glucose before each meal. You can't, with their sensor, you cannot use the CGM reading to actually determine a correction. You have to bolus before you eat. A lot of adolescents absolutely will not do that. In other words, you have to start the insulin bolus for a meal you anticipate you're going to eat, and they'll all say well, what if I want more? Well, you can more food. You can always give more food. But it does automatically adjust basal insulin throughout the day. And let me go back one slide here to show you some very, very good data. This is a good pump. It's just not an artificial pancreas. So if you look at, if you look at the gray zone, this is where the pump and the continuous glucose monitor are unconnected. So this is the patient totally in charge of setting the basal rate, counting the carbs, and the pump does not react in any other way except what it's been instructed to do. And you can see how broad that gray zone is. This is when you put it into a closed loop mode, which is in the lingo of the Medtronic pump is auto mode. This is where the pump itself then will read the CGM. It'll lower the basal rate, raise the basal rate. It does a much better job at night. This is an old figure, but it does a very, very good job here. It's still not very good at handling meals. You can see this is 6 o'clock in the morning. There's the breakfast rise, lunch rise. Not so bad after supper, but there's great potential for this pump. It's a first version. Someday this might be an artificial pancreas. Let's hope. All right. What they're working on now is, and still not available, is a sensor, an infusion catheter that are in the same device. You remember that patient that I showed you earlier who had one site for the CGM, another site for the infusion set? Most people hate wearing that stuff. Most adolescents, and many will refuse to wear any kind of a device because of body image issues. So this is something that's coming. It'll be welcomed. We talked about that. Dexcom, yeah, we just a couple more slides. Dexcom is working with both Tandem, the t:slim, and Omnipod to develop the same systems, same kind of system as the Medtronic pump. This is a very cool thing. InPen. This is an insulin pen, but it's a very smart one. You put in there all sorts of parameters. You tell it your insulin to carbohydrate ratio, so if the patient then through an iPhone enters in carbs that they're expecting to eat, it'll calculate a dose for you. It'll accept blood glucose readings from either a CGM, interstitial glucose readings from a CGM, or blood from a meter, and say, like, your blood glucose is 242, you should give 3.6 units of insulin as a correction. It does all this, and it's kind of looks like low-tech, old technology, but it's actually quite a smart device. So I'm gonna skip over that. Here's something else that's coming. This sugar beet. This is a CGM that does not have an electrode. It has a little kind of a spongy micro device that you just place over the skin. You tape over the skin. It then uses electrophoresis, iontophoresis, like we do a sweat test. It passes a small current over the skin. It draws out interstitial fluid. It measures the glucose. Some of you might remember a thing called the Gluco Watch from like the 80s that actually tried to do this, and it burned a lot of people, and they took it off the market. It physically caused burns. So my last point. We've embraced this technology. This is the use of pumps in children. So this is from the Type 1 Diabetes Exchange, two different periods, not separated by very far, 2010 to 2012, 2016 to 2018. Over that period of time, all Type 1 diabetes patients, this includes adults, and adults often do not tend to use this technology as much as we do in pediatrics, went up from 57 to 63%. In kids, it went up for toddlers, 50 to 60%, 58 to 68%. CGM use has just skyrocketed, and I'm firmly behind this. This is from 2011 to 2018. Huge use of CGMs, and you can see the children, 1 to 5, huge increases in this. We have wonderful tools. So you'd think we're doing a whole lot better in managing pediatric type 1 diabetes. And here's the data. That last graph I showed you is in red from 2000. So this is data from the Type 1 Diabetes Exchange. This is 2010 to 2012. This is 2016 to 2018. It's getting worse. We have expensive technology. It took forever to get insurance companies to buy into this because we kind of made the promise, they made the assumption, things are going to get better, and they're not getting better. So you want an answer. I don't have an answer, but I'll tell you what I think it is. I think what we've done is disengage the patient totally, which is what we need to do ultimately, is have the patient not be at the nucleus of diabetes control. I don't think they should be counting carbs. I don't think they should be eventually having to do thinking about what their blood sugar is. But unfortunately, now you have to. So we have all these children who have these very expensive, complicated devices, and they kind of ignore the output. Those beautiful graphs I showed you from the CGMs, they can do those at home. Their mom can do those. There's an app called the Clarity app. They can do them. Their mom can have those. They can follow these things, but they choose not to. They come into the clinic, and I download these, and we look at them together. It's like, look at this. Did you see this? And they go, what do you think's happening here? Like, oh, I guess I need more insulin. Like, they could have been doing this on their own. What we need is a real artificial pancreas that disengages the patient totally, but we're not there yet. So thank you very much.